Good afternoon. I'm Peggy Hill, Vice President of San Francisco Opera Guild's chapters, and I'm representing the Opera Previews Committee today. The Previews program has been an integral part of the Opera Guild's purpose, arts education, and community outreach. And although live in-person lectures are often the most stimulating, these new virtual previews are an asset to those in the community who are unable to attend an in-person live program to learn more about an upcoming San Francisco opera. Today, we welcome Derek Katz, who will give us insight into Mozart and to Mozart's very popular opera, Don Giovanni. Derek Katz is an associate professor of music history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, from which he received his PhD in 2000. He holds a degree from Harvard and has studied at the Free University of Berlin on a Fulbright fellowship. A specialist in Czech music, Dr. Katz has published articles in Musical, Quarterly, and in multiple Czech journals. A violist who plays in an amateur string quartet in the summer, he has also contributed chapters to books on 19th century chamber music, as well as to Janáček and his world, as well as studying mid-20th century institutional support for professional string quartets in the United States. And you, the audience, can make this program more interesting and interactive by adding your questions into the Q&A section and the button down at the bottom of the screen. And with that, welcome Derek Katz. So excited to learn more about Don Giovanni this afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Peggy. I'm thrilled to be here, if only virtually, and it's very nice to see you, if only virtually. I've had many happy talks in the San Francisco Public Library, so I will imagine myself and you all there, even though I'm sure that none of us actually are. For what it's worth, I'm coming to you just from across the bay in Berkeley, not actually from Santa Barbara. So although I'm sure you don't need the reminder because you've just had it from Peggy, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to give us a queue of questions that we can address at the end of the talk. So if you'll just give me a moment to fumble with the technology, I will share my screen. So, as you gathered from the introduction, I am not a Mozart expert in a scholarly sense, but Don Giovanni is one of my very favorite operas, and it's really the first one that I fell in love with. It's the first opera for which I played the entire score from the orchestra pit as a violist. This would be when I was a sophomore in high school. And I really fell in love not just with the orchestral score, but with the dramatic experience. I have particularly vivid memories of the end of the opera, where this particular production, as is typical, we were surrounded by stage smoke and stage flames. And in this case, the male chorus of demons surrounded the audience from behind and sang in a kind of infernal surround sound. And this obviously struck me and has stuck with me down through the decades. So what I'd like to do, now that I'm an old musicologist, I realize that my sense of Mozart's Don Giovanni is very different from what expectations and understandings would have been at Mozart's time. And so in this presentation, I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense of that slippage or tension in between the conventions and expectations of Mozart's days and those of ours. So what I'll do is I'll give a very brief plot summary. I'd like to talk a little bit about the gestation of the opera, both the immediate circumstances of the collaborations between Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte, and also in the larger context of the Don Juan story. Then the meat, the entree of this particular presentation will be a discussion of the relationships between the social functions of the characters in the opera and the operatic conventions that sort of control their musical and dramatic expression. I'd like to give special attention to the ensembles, the numbers in which multiple characters sing, and I hope appropriately, I would like to end with Don Giovanni being dragged down to hell in the hope that I will have changed the experience for all of us by the time that we get there. Now, I'm assuming I make two assumptions which are sort of contradictory. One is that this is a fairly well-known opera, so that many people are familiar with the workings. The other is that the plot is complicated and a little difficult to follow. So, in brief, the main character of Don Giovanni is, of course, Don Giovanni, nobleman of Spain, rake, libertine, serial lover and lever. He's accompanied at almost all times by his servant, Leporello. The opera begins with the event that will precipitate the rest of the action. Don Giovanni is fleeing Donna Anna, whom he has attempted to seduce, to put it politely. Don Giovanni is then confronted by the commendatore, her father, who challenges him to a duel. Don Giovanni kills the older man in a sword fight. So at this point, the plot has been set into motion, but we have also been introduced to the first of the characters who will revolve around Don Giovanni and Leporello, and that is Donna Anna. In quick succession, we meet the rest of the cast. Anna is quickly joined by Don Ottavio, her betrothed, who appears with her and discovers the body of her father. The next person we meet is Donna Elvira, another noblewoman. She is not from whatever Spanish town this opera is set in, though. She has come from Burgos, where Don Giovanni had seduced her and deserted her. She has come to wherever we are to find Don Giovanni and to attempt to hold him to his promise to be her spouse. After that, we find ourselves at a peasant wedding, at a peasant celebration. And the celebration is a celebration of the wedding of two other characters, another couple, Zerlina and Mazzetto. So as I say, the plot is in some ways very complex and confusing. There are impersonations, there are costumes, there are mistaken identities, there are schemes, there are plots, there are parties, there is drinking, there is dancing. But in some ways, this is all bluster. Not much really happens until the very end of the opera. Really, the stories of the opera is that Don Giovanni attempts but fails to seduce multiple women. So instead of walking you through each attempted and failed seduction, I'd like to just focus on the relationships between these characters and Don Giovanni. And some of this, I'm afraid, is going to be repetitive since I'm not following my own notes. So Donna Anna obviously is motivated by revenge. She wishes to avenge the murder of her father. Don Ottavio is really just sort of an appendage to her. He's a stock character, the romantic lead as a tenor, although he would like to marry Donna Anna. Then we move down to Donna Elvira, who again, her motivation is she wishes to find Don Giovanni and, at least initially, to become his spouse as he has promised. And then Zerlina actually appears, again, at least initially. She seems fairly willing to be seduced by Don Giovanni. Mazzetto, another appendage, is motivated by jealousy. So clearly, it's the women who are really central. The opera, it revolves around Don Giovanni, but more accurately, it revolves around his relationships with these three women. The men largely function, again, as appendages. They tag along to their respective fiancés. I've left out Leporello, who, of course, is motivated by fear and actually, to a certain extent, disgust with his master, Don Giovanni. So inasmuch as there is a plot, the big event waits until the end of the opera. In that end of the opera, Don Giovanni stumbles on a statue of the Commendatore in a graveyard and bravely invites the statue to dinner. In the finale to the second act, the statue actually appears at Don Giovanni's house to accept that invitation and, in turn, to invite Don Giovanni to dine with him below. Don Giovanni accepts this invitation and is dragged down to the nether regions, inevitably amidst flames and chanting demons. So, as I've suggested, I think there are kind of two paths to Don Giovanni. The first would lead us through Mozart's own career. And as I don't have to tell anyone who has been following the course of this trilogy in San Francisco, Don Giovanni is the second of three collaborations between Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and the poet Lorenzo da Ponte. I don't know, there's probably no point in comparing and rating them. I think there might be a general consensus that I'd be willing to go along with, that if The Marriage of Figaro is the most perfect of the three, Don Giovanni is perhaps the most powerful. It's certainly the darkest and the most disturbing. From this point of view, the story of the gestation of Don Giovanni begins not in Mozart's Vienna, but in Prague. And it really actually starts with the Marriage of Figaro. So the Marriage of Figaro was not a huge hit in Vienna, where it was heard only 9 times after opening in May of 1786. But it was incredibly popular in Prague. It's a huge hit after it opened there in December of 1786. One of the consequences is that Prague's society of great connoisseurs and amateurs invited Mozart to Prague, paid his way to come to Prague in January of 1787 to hear a performance and to direct another one. Mozart does exactly this. This is, by the way, the same trip during which the so-called Prague Symphony is first performed. So, on Mozart's first evening in Prague, he attends a ball where much of the dance music is arranged from the Marriage of Figaro. And then he writes, on January 15th, one of the most famous letters from the Mozart literature. In Mozart's words, translated of course, quote, "I was delighted to look upon all these people leaping around in sheer delight to the music of my Figaro, adapted for noisy contradances and waltzes. For here nothing is discussed but Figaro. Nothing is played, bowed, sung, or whistled but Figaro. No opera is succeeding but Figaro, and eternally Figaro. Certainly a great honor for me." And then the next consequence is that Pasquale Bondini, the impresario of the Italian Opera Company, commissions a new opera, which of course will turn out to be Don Giovanni. So Mozart once again collaborates with Lorenzo da Ponte, but this new project is hardly the center of da Ponte's world. Da Ponte, like the Marriage of Figaro, has become very successful very quickly after being appointed court librettist to the Italian theater in Vienna. There were 10 new operas presented at the city theater, the Burgtheater in Vienna in 1786. Of those 10 new operas, 6 had libretti by da Ponte. As a reward for this success, he was presented with 3 possible collaborations for the next season, for 1787. He had possible operas that he could do with Mozart, with Salieri. You remember Salieri from Amadeus, or a third with Vicente Martin y Soler. Da Ponte, being an ambitious young man, decided to do all 3. As he wrote in his diary, quote, "At night I shall write for Mozart and imagine I'm reading Dante's Inferno. In the morning I shall read for Martin and feel as if I am studying Petrarch. In the evening it will be Salieri's turn, and that shall be my Tasso." Fortified by snuff and Italian and Hungarian wine, Da Ponte in fact completes all 3 libretti. So Mozart shows up in Prague in October of 1787. Da Ponte shows up a few days later with his friend Casanova, a wonderful coincidence given the subject of the opera. The premiere is delayed a few times, partially because Mozart wasn't finished. Famously, and perhaps even accurately, Mozart was still writing the overture the night before the opera was to open, passing sheets of manuscript paper still wet with ink out the window to copyists to be then forwarded on to the orchestral players. Might even have happened that way. But there were other reasons as well. Mozart seems to have overestimated the company in Prague, which, despite having had such a success with the Marriage of Figaro, was a small company without understudies for the principal singers and not all that well organized. Although apparently they did have really, really good wind players, something which is reflected both in the fabulous writing for woodwind instruments, in the larger orchestral score for Don Giovanni, and in that wonderful moment in the second act finale when Don Giovanni and Leporello are serenaded by 8 wind players on stage, a kind of wind band that would have been customary for the Viennese, or for that matter, Bohemian nobility at the time. Since, as you know, I do have a background in Czech music, I just want to say a few words about that Czech context. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to show you a picture from the actual San Francisco production. This was supposed to go with the theme of darkness. Here's the slide I thought you were going to see. So here is a somewhat anachronistic engraving of the theater in which Don Giovanni was presented for the first time, and for that matter, the theater in which The Marriage of Figaro was presented so successfully. This is what was known in the 19th century as the Estates Theater in Prague. So this was privately funded by a nobleman, Count Nostitz, sort of as a gift to the city of Prague. It was erected in the old city of Prague. It began in 1781, so it was still a very new theater at the time of Mozart's operas. So it was pretty big by the standards of the time. It held over 1,000 people in the audience, and it was really one of the finest theaters in Central Europe. It was initially built with the intention of holding German opera productions, but the German company was soon replaced by a more successful Italian troupe. That is Bondini's operation, the one that put on The Marriage of Figaro and the one that commissioned Don Giovanni. And for what it's worth, if you want the later history, the theater was purchased by the Bohemian Estates, 1789. At that point, it becomes the Estates Theater. When the Czech nobility and the Czech people began building first a provisional theater and then a national theater, it becomes the Provincial German Theater. So there's a picture of it. This is what it looks like today. You can still go visit it in the old city in Prague. There's a statue in honor of Don Giovanni of the Commendatore by the sculptor Anna Chromny. And then, for what it's worth, this is also the theater that was used for the opera scenes set in Vienna in the movie Amadeus. Then it does move, it being Don Giovanni, does move to Vienna May 7th, 1788, where it's performed in the Burgtheater. You can't go and see that. It hasn't been around for quite a long time. It was destroyed in the late 19th century. It was really only a modest success, though, in Vienna. There were 4 performances initially, eventually 15. The Emperor Joseph, he of Too Many Notes fame, wrote of it, quote, "The opera is divine, possibly, just possibly, even more beautiful than Figaro. But such music is not meat for the teeth of my Viennese." Although I am a musicologist, I will not go into the weeds of the different versions. For what it's worth, as was customary at the time, Mozart made changes to the opera when he presented it in Vienna. Again, as was customary, he wrote new arias for some of the principals. There's a new aria for Don Ottavio. There's also a new duet for Leporello and Zerlina. So Don Giovanni is actually a somewhat unstable text. So the version that we hear today is actually a version that would not have been heard either in Prague or in Vienna. It's kind of a greatest hits version with the best music from both. You don't need to worry about that. But again, as a musicologist, I feel it is my duty to at least mention it. Here's one more slide of the interior of the Burgtheater. So the other path to Don Giovanni, leaving Mozart and Da Ponte aside for the moment, would run through the Don Juan story itself. Don Giovanni, of course, is just Don Juan in Italian. Our hero is just Sir John, as it were, in English. So the Don Juan story was a well-known story throughout Europe long before Da Ponte got his hands on it. There are literary treatments going back over 150 years to the early 17th century, and an even longer history as part of vernacular entertainments. It's a story that would have been improvised by traveling actors at fairs and carnivals, would have been presented as parts of puppet shows. Really, the only other analogous story would be the Faust story, which lived in chapbooks, vernacular theater, and puppet shows before being elevated to the level of world literature by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So by the time of the Da Ponte-Mozart collaboration, it had been used for many plays and operas. I'll return briefly to Goethe, who, as we know, went to Italy in the late 18th century. He wrote later of his time in Rome in 1787, quote, "Thus I found that an opera on Don Juan, not Mozart's, was performed every night for 4 weeks, and that this so excited the city that the whole family of every last shopkeeper filled the stalls and boxes, and no one could go on living who had not seen Don Juan roasted in hell, and the governor, as the late lamented guest, ascend to heaven." So I think there are two important points here. The first is, despite what we might assume from Mozart's Don Giovanni, this was not a serious story. Don Juan was a figure of fun. His story was a series of misadventures, of comic misadventures. The descent to hell was an excuse for fireworks and stagecraft. It wasn't actually supposed to be scary or even morally edifying. Secondly, the characters in the Don Juan story are stock figures, not unique individuals. I've been tried very hard but failed to come up with a modern day counterpart. Perhaps it's a little bit like a fairy tale. I think that we don't think of Goldilocks as a unique individual with an interior psychological life, but rather we think of Goldilocks as the sum of all of the various Goldilocks stories, the children's books and plays and movies and various ways in which we might have encountered her. Or perhaps we can think of these comic acting troupes that would have put on the Don Juan plays as being a little bit like the Marx Brothers. We watch a Marx Brothers movie and Harpo is always Harpo, regardless of what character he is notionally playing in the movie. So similarly, whatever comic base would have been singing the roles that later become Leporello, or even for that matter, that later become Figaro, we would see that singer, that character of the comic servant, rather than thinking again of the Leporellos or the Figaros in these vernacular versions as individuals with emotional lives, with interiority. The most important precedent is a particular opera, though, also entitled Don Giovanni, by the now essentially unknown Giuseppe Gazzaniga, whom you see here, with the libretto by the poet Giovanni Bertatti. I couldn't find a picture of him. So this collaboration, the Gazzaniga-Bertatti Don Giovanni, opened in February of 1787. So I know I'm tossing a lot of dates around. February 1787. Mozart has just been commissioned for a new opera. He's just returning from Prague, so this is perfect timing for our purposes. We know that Da Ponte had the libretto, and we know that Mozart must have seen the music. So Venice is a long way. Venice, I don't think I mentioned that. Venice is where the Gazzaniga version opened. Venice is a long way from Vienna, but the opera world then, perhaps as today, is fairly small and fairly incestuous. There are many direct personal connections between these two versions. The tenor who sang Don Giovanni in Gazzaniga's opera, and yes, Don Giovanni is a tenor for Gazzaniga, that same tenor was the first Don Ottavio for Mozart in Prague. Also, the poet Bertatti succeeded Da Ponte as court dramatist in Vienna. That would have been in 1791. So, were we to compare these two operas, the two Don Giovannis, Gazzaniga and Mozart, this is a comparison that's usually made for two reasons. Either we put the two of them side by side and say, look how much better Mozart is. Or we put the two side by side, we find places that sound similar and say, look, Mozart was influenced by Gazzaniga. I'm not going to do either of those things. I don't really think that either of those points are really worth making. I think the important point that is worth making is that these two operas are very, very different in type. They're generically different. So we could make it, I do want to make two comparisons. So, but again, I want to suggest that they're very different types of operas and that these differences actually explain some things that are important about the Mozart version. So this is kind of a sloppy slide. It would have been worse if I put on the Italian as well. So apologies for using English. On the left, you see a few lines from the Gazzaniga Bertatti version. On the right, you see the equivalent moment from the Mozart da Ponte version. So the point I want to make here is that this is a scene, a sort of dramatic beat, if you will, which is shared by both. So Don Giovanni has just killed the Commendatore, and the same thing happens in both operas. The Leporello or Leporello equivalent, who has been hiding in fear the whole time, hears Don Giovanni's voice and asks, "Is this you?" Don Giovanni says something, and then we get joke number one. Leporello says, "Are you alive or are you dead?" And Don Giovanni says, "What an idiot! Can't you hear that it's me speaking?" And then the Leporello or Leporello equivalent says, you've done two heroic things. You've attacked the daughter and you've killed the father. So if you compare the left and the right, again, you can see on the one hand, the dramatic beats are the same. It's the same sequence of events. On the other hand, they're different words, and you will take my word for it that they would also be different words in Italian. So this is not something that I've cherry picked. This is actually very, very typical, where if you were to watch the entire Gazzaniga Bertati version, you would know exactly what was going to happen next if you know the Mozart da Ponte version. And it's not just because these two versions are similar, it's because the Don Juan story included a very, very predictable series of events, which would have been very, very well known to audiences throughout Europe in Mozart's day. Let us then make a more direct musical comparison. And again, I want to do this not in order to flatter Mozart at Bertati's expense, but rather, moving a little too fast there, but rather to sort of make a point about how the two operas differ. So this is going to be what just precedes that little bit of dialogue. And so this is the little trio where we see the actual duel where Don Giovanni accepts the challenge of the commendatore. There's a little bit of sword play. He runs him through and kills him. And then there's a moment when the commendatore dies. So now, obviously, it depends how you stage it, how you play it. I have stacked the deck I only have 2 DVDs to choose from, but I picked the one which is funny because the point I want to make is that in the Gazzaniga Bertati version, even though this is a murder, it can be played for laughs. Now, I actually think the music is quite good. It's very typical of Italian comic opera at the time, and there's some very effective moments, very pungent harmonies in the death scene. So just a very short clip from the, I assume, almost completely unknown Gazzaniga Bertati version. Now we'll move to the much more familiar Mozart and Da Ponte version. And as you will see, or perhaps as you remember, we follow really exactly the same series of dramatic events. But I think it makes a very different effect because of Mozart's music. And now, again, I think the point isn't that Mozart's music is better. The point is that Mozart is trying to do something different. The first difference is that he really tries to illustrate the sword fight. We hear these rushing scales in the strings, which we can very easily map onto the jabbing of the swords. And then at the point where the commendatore is fatally wounded, as was the case with Gazzaniga, the music changes character, but here in Mozart, it changes even more dramatically to a sort of static, suspended texture, ticking, suspension of time, pop, 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 in the strings, and then this delicate, quiet, hushed trio of three low voices singing together. And this is really, I think, this is music of kind of a liminal space as the commendatore is suspended between life and death, between the natural and the supernatural, a kind of liminal space that Mozart will return to at the very end of the opera. So here's that very same place in the Mozart Da Ponte version.
Lasciala Dio, partiti meco, non mi degno, di pugnar cieco si pretendi, a me fuggir, non mi degno, no, si pretendi, da me fuggir, misero, battiti, misero, misero attendi, se vuoi morire.
And that would take us just to where we were before. So, with apologies to Gazzaniga, I think it's actually a very funny opera worth checking out. We will now leave him and spend the rest of our time with Mozart and with Da Ponte. But I do feel it's worth doing this because there is a consensus that there are certain dramatic problems with Mozart's Don Giovanni, particularly with the ways of staging it. There is a question of what is the sort of basic nature of the opera? Is it comic? Is it tragic? How do we perceive it? There are also strange things about the physical setup. If you compare it to The Marriage of Figaro, where we are immediately placed in a building and acquainted with its dimensions, Don Giovanni takes place in open, undefined spaces. In the words of the director Jonathan Miller, quote, "Throughout the opera, the characters wander as though in a nightmare through apparently familiar locations, a disheveled landscape in which places which ought to be separate from one another are mysteriously adjacent." It's also a little difficult to get a grip on the characters. They have titles, Don this, Donna that, Il Commendatore, but they lack the kind of context that would give them a social reality. We don't really know who they are aside from the relationships, perhaps with the people that they're engaged to, or more immediately to Don Giovanni. Then we again think of the confusions caused by the mistaken identities, the costumes, the darkness in which so much of the opera takes place. So these things seem problematic staging the opera in the 20th and 21st centuries, but in many ways, all of these things make perfect sense for an Italian comic opera at the end of the 18th century, in which stock characters move through well-known situations. We don't need interior lives or backstories. We just have characters, again, as if from either the Marx Brothers or the Commedia dell'arte. We know where the banana peel is going to be. We know that somebody is going to slip on it. Similarly, we don't need a realistic set with spaces that are connected to each other in geographically realistic ways. That wouldn't be plausible for that puppet show or those improvising actors in the vernacular theater. So in that way, Don Giovanni makes perfect sense as a drama of its time, if not as a more elevated opera for ours. These things become problematic or even sinister in Mozart, where we expect actual characters that we understand in a more psychologically realistic way. So to then open this up, I'd like to move on to this question of who people are in terms of social class and who they are in terms of operatic types. So sure, we can look at that. Why not? My basic premise here is that there are different classes of people and different types of opera. So for people, in gross terms, there are two types. There's nobility and not nobility, aristocracy, servants. Again, we're familiar with this from the Marriage of Figaro, although in Don Giovanni, there's a significant third term in the non-aristocrat category, and those are peasants. So again, aristocrats, non-aristocrats, nobility, servants, and peasants, two teams. For opera, we also have two kinds, opera buffa and opera seria. So I don't want to, again, give the whole music history shtick, but just in really, really rough terms, opera seria or serious opera is something which becomes standardized in the 1720s. So this is a generation before Mozart. Plots from ancient history, perhaps mythology, rigid rules for construction of libretti, constructing of a series of long arias, each expressing a single emotion. So this is an elevated entertainment for elevated audiences, featuring virtuoso singers, especially high voices, sopranos, either female sopranos or castrati. So opera buffa, comic opera, on the other hand, it's of course comic, and it deals with contemporary characters in these comic situations. These tend to feature low male voices in these leading comic roles. So by Mozart's day, opera seria is in decline. He does compose 4 of them, including 2 reasonably well-known ones, Idomeneo and La Clemenza di Tito, but they're not heard anywhere near as often as his comic operas. Don Giovanni, like all 3 of the Da Ponte operas, is generically an opera buffa. Now, this may sound like an odd statement because opera buffa is comic opera and Don Giovanni isn't funny. Well, it may be funny, but the funny elements are dark, even cruel. But in terms of its structure, its themes, and even the terms of its commission, it's an opera buffa. It's got 2 acts, it has a contemporary setting, it has familiar roles like Leporello, the comic servant, that would have been familiar from the world of comic opera. So like Figaro in The Marriage of Figaro, Leporello is a classic buffo base, and that similarity is emphasized in the very end of the opera, the finale to Act 2, the supper scene, that wind band that serenades Don Giovanni and Leporello, plays, amongst other things, excerpts from Marriage of Figaro, and Leporello gets to impersonate Figaro for a moment there. But one of the things that makes these Da Ponte operas so distinctive and special is that elements of opera seria can be mixed into the larger opera buffa context. So what I'd like to do next is just do a couple short demonstrations of these relationships between social class and opera type. So let's start near the beginning of the first act with that peasant wedding celebration that I alluded to before. So these are, of course, the peasants. They're initially presented as a group we do meet two individuals, Zerlina and Mazzetto, but they emerge from the collective. They have been singing and they have been, well, not singing yet, but they've been dancing with their friends and the co-villagers, I guess, before we meet them as individuals. What are they dancing? A rustic jig. So that's a particular dance type that would have been recognizable to Mozart's audiences. What do they sing? Simple melody in the sort of folk or popular style. And I think we think of this as a song. That is, as Don Giovanni and Leporello are observing this wedding, they say, oh, look, here are peasants singing and dancing. Obviously, everybody sings in operas, but this is something that would be perceived as a song, even in the context of opera world. So I think the words that Zerlina and Mazzetto and the other peasants sing, we assume it's part of a pre-existing song. It doesn't represent the actual feelings or emotions of Zerlina or Mazzetto. So it's very different from the arias that we will encounter later. And this basic light dance-like character, in addition to being inappropriate because they are actually dancing, this is kind of the baseline musical language for opera buffa, for comic opera in Italy, even when people aren't dancing. And so this is very short. We can watch the whole thing. Here is the peasant chorus and dance from Act 1, featuring Zerlina and Mazzetto.
Giovinetti leggeri di testa, leggeri di testa, non andate girando qua e là e là e qua e qua e là. Poco dura ne batti la festa, ma per me cominciato non ha, cominciato non ha. Che piacere che sarà. Che piacere che sarà. Vieni carina godiamo, e cantiamo, balliamo, saltiamo. Vieni carina godiamo, che piacere che sarà. Che piacere che sarà.
So that's a number that could exist in almost any Italian comic opera. It's actually very similar to its equivalent number in Gazzaniga. So that's sort of team one, peasants, not nobility, comic opera, opera buffa. Team two, of course, are the nobility, represented here by Donna Anna and Don Ottavio. So these are people that we meet as people. They have names. We meet them as individuals first. And their basic musical language is not popular song and dance, but the aria, and more specifically, the aria of serious opera, of opera seria. So Donna Anna doesn't just get a song the way that Zerlina does. She gets an aria, and it's an aria that's an entire scene that starts with what we call accompanied recitative, where she has sort of speech-like song, but accompanied by the full orchestra for emphasis and moving through different characters and tempos, exactly as we would encounter in a serious opera. Also, we get a certain amount of vocal virtuosity, sort of operatic display for its own sake. As far as the character, Donna Anna, unlike Zerlina, doesn't dance onto stage. She moves in a sort of stately march. And again, this all fits with the general mode of opera seria, which is a long series of scenes. Each a character enters, sings an aria, exits, new character, new scene, new aria. This is about the it's about the singer and about vocal display more than about the character. So as an example, let's hear Donna Anna's first aria. Now, again, this is a long scene. I've trimmed it, and even trimming it, it's going to be longer than the chorus that you just heard. So it's going to start in the middle of the recitative, but you'll get a little bit of that accompanied recitative, and then sort of the first half of the aria. And again, you'll hear it's that sort of a slow, majestic march. If you listen to the lower strings, dom, borle dom, 2, 1, too, and then these march-like figures in the woodlands. Yum, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. What else do we want to know about that? I think that's enough. Let's just listen to it.
Allora rinforzo i strade mie, chiamo soccorso. Fugge il fellon. Arditamente inseguo fin nella strada per fermarlo. E sono assalitrice da salita. Il padre va corre, vuol conoscerlo. E l'iniquo, che del povero vecchio era più forte. Compie il misfatto suo. Compie il misfatto
Okay, and I apologize for cutting it off in the middle. So again, I'm sure I'm overemphasizing this. So we have two types of people: peasants, nobility; two types of opera: opera buffa, opera seria; even two different types of physical movement: the dance of the rustic jig and the aristocratic stately march. And so to me, it feels as if Donna Anna has walked in or marched in from a different kind of opera. So the sort of the normal unmarked language is that of opera buffa, which is true of the classical style in general. The language of Mozart's instrumental music, his piano concertos, his symphony, is basically opera buffa. And then when we have opera seria elements like Donna Anna or like the opening of the Jupiter Symphony, these are exceptions. These are the ornaments, the changes. So this is all well and good, but what makes things really interesting, or perhaps confusing, is that there are also people in the middle. So I'm thinking now of Donna Elvira, of Don Giovanni, and of Leporello. So socially, Donna Elvira and Don Giovanni are part of the aristocracy. Leporello isn't, although he is sort of part of their world by virtue of being employed by Don Giovanni. But in operatic terms, there is such a thing as a character who is situated in between opera seria and opera buffa. This is what would have been known at the time as a part di mezzo carattere, so the character in the middle. And lest you think that this is some kind of abstruse, pointy-headed musicologist thing, this is how Mozart himself absolutely thought about things. So there's another famous letter from Mozart now to his father that he wrote after completing the abduction from the Seraglio, and he was thinking about plans for a subsequent opera. And Mozart wrote, quote, "The most essential thing is that the story on the whole be truly comic. And if possible, the librettist ought to introduce two equally good female parts. One must be seria, the other mezzo caratera, but both roles must be absolutely equal in quality. The third female character, however, may be entirely buffa." So, although it takes him a while to get around to it, this is exactly the plan for Don Giovanni. Donna Anna Donna Elvira are the two equally good female parts, one seria, Donna Anna, the other mezzo caratera, Donna Elvira. This leaves, of course, Zerlina as entirely buffa. So it's actually not two teams, but three possibilities. So let's again briefly hear one of Donna Elvira's arias. And so in some ways, this is very much from opera seria, which is appropriate because Donna Elvira is, of course, a noblewoman. So she's a noblewoman. This is a rage aria. She is furious with Don Giovanni. She is warning Zerlina off of him. And the rage aria is a very well-known type, very familiar character from opera seria. And indeed, it's very virtuoso, more so, in fact, than Donna Anna's music. Donna Elvira is the one that gets the passage work, the rushing scales, particularly at the very end of this aria. But there's something oddly old-fashioned, almost Baroque about this aria. It sounds almost more appropriate for Handel than for Mozart. It's strings, there's no winds in the orchestra, and there are these incessant dotted rhythms which feel almost sort of French overture-like. Again, they evoke to me the world of Handel or Bach, much, much further back than Mozart. So she's still wandering in from a different opera, but it may be a third opera. It's not the same one that Donna Anna came from. And in some ways, this is appropriate because Donna Elvira is the only out-of-towner. She has come from Burgos. Now, conventionally, the Don Giovanni is supposed to be set in Seville, although I believe that appears nowhere in the original libretti. Seville is 440 miles away from Burgos. That would be a very long way for her to have come, for what it's worth. Nonetheless, she's from someplace else, geographically and chronologically, stylistically, in opera terms. Also, it's a really short opera. It's a really short aria. Unlike Donna Anna, she doesn't get a full scene with accompanied recitative. I'm going to give you just a little fragment of the recitative that precedes it, and you'll hear it's the kind of what we call secco recitative, dry recitative, just accompanied by the harpsichord, where she is in dialogue with Don Giovanni and Zerlina. And again, the fact that she is singing this aria to Zerlina, that she's interacting with the peasantry as she sings it, this is another one of these functions of the mixed characters. The music's different, but also their social function is different, sort of mediating between the different social levels. So here's a brief but brilliant aria from Donna Elvira.
Fermati, scelerato! Incendi che ci udiran le tue perfidie! Io sono a tempo di salvar questa misera innocente dal tuo barbaro artiglio! Meschina, cosa sento? Amor, consiglio! Idol mio, non vedete ch'io voglio divertirmi? Divertirti? È vero! Divertirti? Io so crudele come tu ti diverti! Oh, signor cavaliere, è ver quel che la dice? La povera infelice rimè innamorata, e per pietà deggio fingere amore, ch'io son per mia disgrazia uom di buon cuore. A voi che tradito, da non lasciar per dir, per la prete con
So that is quite something, yes. And if you go through, for instance, Cecilia Bartoli's back catalog, there are plenty of movies of her singing rage arias from Vivaldi operas, much the same affect, but much earlier time period. So if Donna Elvira is sort of a mixed character from above as a noblewoman, then she would be matched by Leporello as another sort of single, as it were, unattached character coming from below. So I've already suggested that Leporello as a servant is really sort of a classic buffo bass, which he is, and both his opening aria and the so-called catalog aria are classic buffa arias. But he spends much of the opera either impersonating or being mistaken for Don Giovanni. So there's this weird sense in which, although he's a buffo bass, he can kind of shapeshift and become a noble person, both in terms of the actual drama, what he's wearing, and in terms of his vocal production. So that is a very peculiar, non-typical thing. So this sort of seems to create a symmetrical structure, right? We have the pair of lovers from the nobility up at the top, Donna Anna and Don Ottavio. We have the lovers from the peasantry at the bottom, Zerlina and Mazzetto. We have these two sort of ambiguous figures, Donna Elvira and Leporello, one from the nobility, one servant, which of course leaves Don Giovanni in the middle. And he is, in fact, central in so many senses. So he's central in terms of this little chart that I've made up. He is central to the action. Everything revolves around him. But I would argue he's also sort of middle as a voice. He is neither the romantic lead tenor of Don Ottavio, or for that matter, of Gazzaniga's Don Giovanni, nor is he the buffo bass of Leporello, or for that matter, of Figaro. He's a baritone, middle voice for a middle character. And famously, Don Giovanni has no sort of signature sound. He doesn't have a grand opera seria scene. He seems to always adapt to circumstances. When he's pretending to be Leporello, he sings an opera buffa patter aria. He's always performing something. He's serenading Donna Elvira's maid with his mandolin. He's singing, in that case, he's singing a popular song to please a servant. Or he's singing a duet with Zerlina, where he sings a sort of popular song, La ci darem la mano, which Mozart must have known would be the hit tune from the opera. So again, meeting Zerlina sort of on her own musical territory. I think, though, the big payoff for all of that, sorry, I'm going to skip forward, the big payoff for this relationship that I'm trying to sell you on between social type and operatic type happens in the big ensembles, the finales to the first and second acts, or the ensembles in the middle of the acts, the quartet in the middle of Act 1, or the sextet in the middle of Act 2. And, sorry, lost my place in my own notes. These are long stretches of continuous music in different tempos in mood, which accompany rapid and dramatically involved action. So this is very different either from the predictable alternation of recitative and aria in opera seria, or for that matter, the series of comic situations largely forwarded through recitative that we find in opera buffa. These are the parts that feel more like later operas to us, as the music constantly shifts to meet the changing dramatic needs. So in addition to this more naturalistic flow of events, it also allows for a mixture of the types of social and operatic codes that I've been discussing up until now. So the most obvious example would be in the finale to the first act, where there's a party in Don Giovanni's palace. There are three orchestras, each playing a different dance. Each dance is for a different social group. So the first orchestra is playing an aristocratic minuet, sort of hearkening back to the time of Louis XIV in Paris. This, of course, is danced by Donna Anna and Don Ottavio. The second orchestra strikes up a more modern contra dance. This was a very popular dance later in the 18th century. This was what was actually popular in Mozart's day. Remember, when Mozart was in Prague at that ball, what was he hearing? Noisy contra dances. This was a more democratic dance. This is as social dance was moving from an element of aristocratic display to something that was an amateur amusement. And it was a group dance. So this second one, the contra dance, is danced by Don Giovanni and Zerlina. It's a mixed meeting place. It's a place where the nobility and the peasantry can come together, but since it's a group dance, they can also sort of hide in that group. Finally, the third dance is a kind of rustic peasant dance, a rustic German dance. That's danced by Leporello and Mazzetto. So Mazzetto is both physically constrained by Leporello and socially constrained by his dance type to the group of peasants, while Zerlina is capable of rising up, different orchestra, different dance, relationship with Don Giovanni. I was thinking about showing you that scene, but I couldn't find a version in which you can see all three operas and in which it's staged and which all those things that I told you in a way that makes all of those things clear. So instead, I'm going to give you a couple minutes from my very favorite number from the opera, the sextet in the middle of the second act. So the situation here, Leporello, who in a cloak belonging to Don Giovanni is pretending to be Don Giovanni, is walking with Donna Elvira through a courtyard at night. Donna Elvira is frightened and hopes that the gentleman whom she believes is Don Giovanni will protect her. Leporello, on the other hand, wants to find a door and exit. He wants to escape before Donna Elvira figures out who he is. Then two couples appear in turn. First, Donna Anna and Don Ottavio enter the same courtyard. Don Ottavio is attempting to comfort Donna Anna, who is despondent with grief. Leporello finally finds the door and is about to make his escape when he is seized by the entering second couple, Mazzetto and Zerlina. They are furious with Leporello because, stick with me here, Don Giovanni, pretending to be Leporello, has just beaten up Mazzetto. That's just the first part of the sextet, but that will be enough for us. Mozart's music is both emotionally evocative, but also tied to the character's distinctive modes of expression. So to set the scene, we get a couple bars of soft, sort of mysterious, spooky night music. There are repeated notes in the violin, ta 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 ta. That's the beating of Donna Elvira's heart as she is anxious. As Donna Elvira sings, we get figures, not too loud, but sort of little muted outbursts from the violin. That's as she sings of her fear. So that's the one thing. But then when Leporello starts to sing, although we still have to stay quiet because people are hiding and it's nighttime, suddenly the mood brightens. It becomes perkier. The rhythms and harmonies are simpler. In a word, it's opera buffa again. Even in the middle of the night, in costume, we get this little buffo moment for Leporello. Then we get the noble couple, Donna Anna, Don Ottavio. Dramatic change of key and affect. They are accompanied by the noble instruments of trumpets and drums. Even though they're playing very quietly, that's still what we hear. Drum roll, trumpets. What are they playing? Of course, a stately aristocratic march as the two march in to the scene, as they did for their arias. It's the same character we know from the aria of Donna Anna that we just heard. What do they sing? Expressive vocal lines that go from very low in the range to very high. Again, the world of aria, not the world of song. Simple contrast. The comfort from Don Ottavio is in the major mode. When Donna Anna begins to sing, it moves to a plangent minor for her grief. Then, when the focus shifts back to Donna Elvira, her music comes back. We're no longer in the world of opera seria. We're in that mixed world of sort of semi-serious Donna Elvira stuff. Got this sort of new figure where she's sort of sobbing, ta-ta, 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 ta-ta. And then as Leporello sings, we get buffo figures. Finally, the whole group sings in unison. Well, not the whole group, everyone but Leporello. They sing at Leporello as he answers those buffa figures' return. So again, it's just a couple minutes of music, but you'll hear these very familiar modes: mixed, comic, serious, mixed, comic, as the different singers sing, as the focus is literally on them.
Il cuore io sento e m'assale un tal spavento che mi sembra di morire, che mi sembra di morire. Più che cerco, men ritrovo questa porta sciagurata. Piano l'ho trovata, ecco il tempo di fuggire, ecco il tempo di fuggire, ecco il tempo di fuggire. sposo io. Se mi trova sol perduto, una porta là vicino che potevo partir, che potevo partir. Dove te vai? E poi frenai, amore che m'attravevo, che m'attravevo. Mio marito, pietà, donna Elvira, quella ch'io vedo, il credo.
Sorry, again, no good place to cut that. So for me, this is the real genius of Mozart and Don Giovanni. He's simultaneously revealing the inner psychology and emotions of the characters, but also using these operatic conventions to add additional layers of meaning. Again, layers that I think would have been much more perceptible in Mozart's day than in ours. But, I'm basically at the end of the talk, and I still haven't mentioned the most famous, the most emblematic music in the opera. When Milos Forman needed to pick a couple minutes of Don Giovanni for his movie Amadeus, he didn't pick the sextet, he didn't pick the dances, he didn't pick La Ci Dorem la Mano. He chose, of course, the return of the Commendatore in the Act II finale. Now a statue, the stone guest returning to invite Don Giovanni to dine with him in hell, appearing, singing Don Giovanni's name. In the movie, this is where the statue breaks through a brick wall into interrupting Don Giovanni's supper. And this music is also the very first music that we hear at the beginning of the overture, before the curtain even opens. I think openings are very important. The first thing that we hear tells us what the entire opera or piece or presentation will be like. There are all sorts of symmetries. The beginning of the overture returns at the end of the opera. The death of the Commendatore at the beginning is echoed by his return at the end. The sword fight at the beginning is a conflict between the Commendatore and Don Giovanni, observed by a terrified Leporello. Again, rhymes with the conflict at the end as the Commendatore drags Don Giovanni down to hell. Again, watched over or under by Leporello. So let's see. Again, there are things I could say about this, but I think the big point is, to me, this stands outside of these things I've been talking about, opera seria and opera buffa. This is just music that almost doesn't seem to come from the world of opera. What the Commendatore and Don Giovanni sing, it's not conventionally melodic. It's not a theme. The music is sort of all rhythm and texture. Tum, pa-pum, pum, those insistent rhythms, or these insinuating scales in the inner voices, spooky music. It's all sort of effect, and it is incredibly effective. So since I've promised it to you, here's just a couple minutes of the Commendatore appearing at the very end of the opera.
L'avrei giammai creduto, ma farò quel che potrò. Leporello, l'oltre cena, fa che subito si porti a padron padron sian tutti morti. Fanne
Once again, no good place to stop. Sorry. So this is where I want to sort of, create the impression of narrative closure. If that wonderful music that we heard during the commendatory's death, that sort of static music, which I was suggesting was music of a liminal space between the natural and the supernatural, this is where that returns. Obviously not the music itself, but that idea of a musically and sort of conceptually liminal space. Now it is Don Giovanni who is hovering between life and death, between the natural and the supernatural. And I think that Mozart's audiences might perhaps have understood this in the context of opera seria and heard the voice of the commendatore as being the voice of the oracle or some other otherworldly figure. But to later audiences, to romantic audiences, and I think also to us, we would connect this to what was at the time a newly emerging aesthetic category, and that is the category of the sublime, the experience of confronting the terror of vast nature, of the supernatural, of war, but as an aesthetic experience in opera, in a symphony, in a painting. This is what opera audiences experienced in the Wolfsglen scene in Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz. It's what London audiences would have experienced when hearing the music of battle in Haydn's Military Symphony at the end of the 18th century. It's what viewers of Caspar David Friedrich's paintings of isolated figures looking out over moonscapes, over vast, threatening landscapes filled with fog would have experienced. And that experience of the sublime, that's something that Mozart had access to, even if he wouldn't have used that word for it, that other composers of the time did not. And so I think for us, for modern audiences, Don Giovanni can sort of stand as just one fragment of the larger late Mozart experience, a basic structure in musical language coming from those light, dance-like resources of comic opera, possibly using the elevated register of opera seria as a contrast, but also with this access to the darker, more frightening, but in some ways aesthetically more powerful sublime. I think that's what we get from the opening chords of the overture, is what we get from the opera as a whole. So thank you very much. I would much rather be in the same room with you, but I will now invite, first I will thank John Morris for having me here and thank the San Francisco Opera Guild chapter for having me here. I will invite John back and we will entertain your questions.
Thank you, Derek. Absolutely wonderful and fascinating presentation, and appreciated your sort of clips, audio and video clips as well, and your insights. I'm John Morris, Education Program Manager for San Francisco Opera Guild. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. And now we're going to open it up to Q&A. We have had some questions come in. And again, if you do have a question for Derek, you can find the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type it in there. Helen asks, is the name Leporello a play on some Italian word? And is it sort of a joke?
That is a very good question to which I do not know the answer. I'm sorry, I have to just plead total ignorance. That's not the name used in other versions of the Don Juan story, and I honestly don't know where it comes from. I will try to find out, but not soon enough to be helpful today. Apologies.
No problem, something to look into.
Yeah.
Andrea asks, vocally, what is the difference between the roles of Don Giovanni, Leporello, and Massetto? And are they lower, higher, more legato? And then she has the same question for Donna Anna, Donna Elvira, and Zerlina. And do sopranos often migrate from one role to another during their careers?
Yeah, another really good question. Oh, by the way, hi, Brad. Nice to see you. Brad Wade apparently has the answer to the question that I didn't. He says that he's heard that Leporello is related to the Italian for rabbit, which etymologically sounds very plausible to me. So let's go with that. I trust Brad. So the question about vocal types, I mean, first off, I'm not a singer myself. I'm not well versed in vocal pedagogy, but it's confusing because, vocal types were defined differently in Mozart's day than they are today. So it's certainly true that, frequently the same singer will have both Don Giovanni and Leporello in his repertoire. It's certainly true that the same singer might have Donna Anna and Donna Elvira in her repertoire. I'm sure many of you have seen the televised production of the Peter Sellers staging of Don Giovanni, in which Don Giovanni and Leporello are sung by twins who obviously have very, very similar voices. As far as the way the parts are written, it's, there's nothing that prevents a single human being from singing all of those low roles, including Mazzetto. Mazzetto is less vocally demanding. It lies a little lower in the range. It doesn't have much legato singing. There's no passage work to speak of. But to a certain extent, on the one hand, it seems potential. Okay, some commentators think it is important that Don Giovanni be a baritone and Leporello be a bass, because they would like Leporello to be that classic opera buffa bass, and they want Don Giovanni to be that sort of middle character. On the other hand, the fact that both Don Giovanni and Leporello vocally impersonate each other suggests that that possibility needs to at least be open. The voices need to be similar enough that they can sort of fool us into thinking that they can be each other, as it were, vocally as well as sartorially. And then, I think, as they say, Donna Elvira, there's more passage work, part lies slightly higher. That might very well be more suited. I so far as I know, Cecilia Barsley doesn't sing Donna Anna. I think the lighter, faster role of Donna Elvira is better suited to her. I'm sure she could sing Donna Anna. It just would project differently. So yeah, it's sort of a judgment call.
Thank you. Another question came in. I read on the SF Opera website that the action of the opera spans 24 hours. Is this typical for Mozart da Ponte and other operas as well?
Yes. So the idea, it's one of the Aristotelian dramatic unities, right? And so one of those rigid conventions of opera seria is like neoclassical drama in general. It's supposed to obey the unities of time, place, and action. So opera seria is a little less strict than, let's say, I don't know, early 19th century French tragedy, or the operas based on that. But yes, we would expect either an opera seria opera, so Idomeneo or La Clemenza di Tito, or something like the Marriage of Figaro, to generally, now as I'm saying that, I have to think if that's true of those particular operas. But yes, we would expect things to take place within the span of a day. That's one of the rules.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And sorry if I get interrupted. So it's one of the ways in which the Magic Flute, as a German Singspiel, stands outside of all that. We don't have that. The chronology is very hazy there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Speaking of opera seria, we have another question from Sandra. The 3 layers of female characters, as you mentioned, represent seria, buffa, and what was the term you used for the in-between character?
Yeah, so the part di mezzo cattera, I can maybe type that in somewhere, actually. And again, that's not a type of opera. It's just a type of character. It was actually identified by the librettist Carlo Goldoni, who also invented this thing called the drama giocoso, which is, technically speaking, the genre for Don Giovanni. And that's, there's a lot of not very interesting scholarly debate about this, but part of that is this idea of the multiple levels, the comic opera that includes the serious characters and the mixed characters as well.
Thank you. And another question is, you mentioned that Mozart added arias to Don Giovanni before it premiered in Vienna. And was that due to audience response, or just the fact that he was kind of running late in the process, or?
Oh no, this is all singer driven. So, if we go back, really, as late as the middle of the 19th century, there's an assumption that an opera is going to be tailored to the specific singers in the particular house that are producing it. So that usually happens at the premiere, but if there's going to be a substantial second production, it was conventional for the star singers in that second production to ask, first off, for something new that people hadn't heard before, but also something that was tailored specifically to their voices. So in this case, the first thing that the Donna Anna and Donatavio says, well, I want new arias. So it's, in the case of Donatavio, it's a swap. We lose one, we gain the second one, but we love tenor arias, so now we include both of them.
Absolutely, thank you. So our last question is, which is your favorite Mozart opera, or do you have several?
Oh, wow. I'm tempted to give one of those totally cliched answers, like it's the one I'm playing at the time or something like that. But I guess, I mean, for me, it's not that one is better than the others. I think it really just has to do with when I encountered them. So, I mean, the ones that are really special to me, which I think are also totally fabulous, are, The Marriage of Figaro, because that's the first one I played, even though I didn't get to play the whole thing, and Don Giovanni, because, again, I got immersed with it, playing it over and over in the pit for a full semester, and then The Magic Flute, which is the first, well, I guess it was the second opera that I saw in a professional production on a school trip, and then I got to conduct it in college. So again, I really got immersed in it. So for me, that's my trinity: Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Magic Flute, which is not to say that the others are in any way lesser. It's just my
Mhm.
own peculiar biography.
Nice choices. I'd like to remind everyone that the recording of this virtual preview will be sent out to everyone who registered, all of our attendees, and that others who are interested in viewing it on demand can register on the website through July 2nd, which is the run of the production at San Francisco Opera. And with that, I would like to welcome Peggy Hill back to our virtual stage for
Right.
final remarks.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Derek Katz. Thank you, John and Teddy, for organizing all of this. And to all, don't forget to sign up 1 week from today, noon. We're going to have another preview, this one on the Dream of the Red Chamber. And if you can't attend Don Giovanni in person, guess what? Live streaming is available. It will happen on June 12th at 2 p.m. Again, just go to the San Francisco Opera website and it'll show you how to sign up. $25. And it'll be the live performance. You'll be watching the live performance. They're going to also do that with the Dream of the Red Chamber on June 19th at 2 p.m. And the Un Sun Kim's Conducts Verdi will be live also streaming June 30th at 7:30 p.m. So a chance, in case you can't get out of the house or have a problem getting into the city, you will be able to watch these performances. $25. And so looking forward, hoping to see all of you virtually or in person soon, and live maybe next week. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.